Welcome to The Voice of Retail. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc. This podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Retail Council of Canada. Being a CEO in the modern age is one of the most complex and challenging roles in business. Notwithstanding that, there has been no guidebook or framework that describes what excellence looks like in this all-important role. My guest on this episode is Carolyn Dewar, senior partner at McKinsey & Company and co-author of the compelling new book, CEO Excellence, The 6 Mindsets That Distinguish the Best Leaders from the Rest. Originally from Canada, now living in San Francisco, Carolyn takes us through the essence of her CEO Excellence practice and book, starting with the 6 critical responsibilities of a CEO to help us set the frame. Then we dive into the 6 mindsets that set elite CEOs apart. Whether you're a CEO today, aspiring to a leadership position, or a business excellence student, this podcast is for you.
The first, for example, on setting direction, it's about truly being bold and having the courage not only to reframe what the company's trying to do and what the art of the possible is, but really swing resources behind the big bets that you're making.
Let's listen in now. Carolyn, welcome to the Voice of Retail podcast.
Thanks for having me.
How are you doing this morning? Where am I finding you in the world?
Well, I am a born and bred Canadian, but I am in the Bay Area at the moment.
Well, I have to admit, I did play the Canadian card in getting this interview. I did notice you were a Canadian. So, like I said, welcome and thanks so much for joining me. I have to say, you're actually, I believe, not the first McKinsey consultant, but the first actual working McKinsey consultant. I've had a lot of former folks from McKinsey, Hubert Joly, Sally Potchford, but I'm really thrilled that I actually have an active McKinseyite on the podcast.
There you go, today. Alive and in the
flesh. Real time. All right, well, let's jump right in. Tell us about yourself, your personal, professional background, and what you do at McKinsey.
Sure. As I said, Carolyn Dewar, I'm a senior partner here. I joined in 2000, which, is a long time ago now, in Toronto. And then I've been out here for the last 10 years or so. And I have a regular day job at McKinsey serving clients and helping them transform. But I also founded and lead our CEO Excellence service line broadly, which is an exciting part of how I spend my day.
Well, and of course, that's one of the reasons we're here today, talk about the new book, CEO Excellence, but we'll get to that in a bit. Now, certainly a name familiar to my listeners, McKinsey, but not everyone maybe understands the scope and the scale of the business, areas of practice, what makes you different from similar type organizations. You'd probably say there are no similar type organizations, but tell us about McKinsey a little bit.
Sure. So McKinsey is a management consulting firm. We've been around amongst the longest, 90 plus years now, and work across 130 cities and countries all around the world. So we're very, very global, going across industries and functions. And we work every day with our clients to help them really transform their performance and their strategy and their organizations and to do great things. So it's wonderful to be with you today.
And how many of there would you be? Like how big a organization? I know you're global, but
I think we are north of 30,000 colleagues at the moment. So we've grown pretty rapidly in the last couple of decades.
And, I've known a bunch of and have friends who are McKinsey, and their life pre-COVID was 4 days on the road, Fridays back in the office, or maybe on the beach writing for great McKinsey thought leadership. What's your life like now in the COVID era? Has it been different? And you're probably traveling less. Is that more productive? Is it better? Is it something that you'll continue to do? Talk about that for a bit.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating time, I think, for all of us, right? Going from, as you say, being on the road almost all the time to suddenly grounded here at home. And it's been wonderful in terms of getting to spend time with family and reconnect. And I think we've all been really surprised how well it's worked from a client service point of view, right? Of course, there's things you miss, and we're certainly getting back into meeting people for important top team offsites and one-on-one dinners. I mean, there's no replacement for that relationship building. But day to day, people have worked remarkably well, probably because a lot of my clients have been remote as well. And it's extraordinary how quickly we all kind of pivoted. And now you can be in 5 cities in one day, which is a great thing.
In my discussions with C-level executives, and I write a report for Retail Council of Canada, I talk to dozens and dozens of C-level executives every quarter. So I get to interact. I have the fun of interacting as well. And many of them would rank productivity quite highly from the COVID era. And many would also admit they would have never in their entire lives expected to be hiring people that weren't showing up at the doorstep each and every day. Do you think this is something that's going to stick? Like, will this be one of those long-term implications structurally of the COVID era?
I certainly don't think we will snap back to the way it was. Right. But my hope is, and what we're hearing from a lot of the CEOs we're talking to is, how do we bring together the best of what was before with some of the great learnings and innovations of the last 2 years to kind of reinvent what it looks like going forward, right? There are these moments where it's hard to replace in person, right? When someone is new and onboarding into the culture of an organization, or when you're having a really important development discussion. There's some of these moments that being together really, really matters. And then there's a lot of work that I think we've all realized we can do from anywhere. And I think that's the moment we're in now, is trying to navigate what makes sense, right? And how are we going to weave these new options together going forward?
Yeah, and I've talked to some executives who say, maybe that doesn't happen in the office. Maybe we build culture outside of the 9-to-5 office, right? Whether that's business conferences or purpose-built, get-togethers with the people, right? I mean, your point is great about it's tough to inculcate into the culture from, your home office, right? I mean, that's just very difficult, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things we learned in all the CEO interviews and conversations was how importantly they take culture, right? I think everyone knows it intuitively, but these CEOs we talked to were laser focused. What is the culture we're trying to build or shift? Right? And they could name it. And in many cases, it was one thing, right? They weren't trying to be innovation and customer experience and simple and. They had one or two things they were really trying to drive. And then they managed them with as much rigor as you would any operational initiative, right? And so if that's the culture you're trying to create, are you measuring it? Do you actually know if it's working or not, right? Do you know how people feel about their interactions? And are you setting expectations for leaders on how to behave? And are you hardwiring it into your people processes and how you spend time? I mean, it's real work, but the CEOs we talk to take it very, very seriously and don't just leave it to chance. Anyway,
listen, it's a great segue to, let's talk about the book, CEO Excellence, the 6 mindsets that distinguish the best leaders from the rest. So first of all, let's talk about the tradecraft of writing the book and the process and how you and your co-authors went and created both the idea for the book and then how it came together.
I mean, we really married together two things. One is the quantitative analysis and level of rigor you would expect from McKinsey, right? So we ran the numbers on performance of CEOs, their tenure, what have they done and not done. So really, dove in deeply to identify through a number of filters, what is this group of truly excellent CEOs? Who has really done this well? And that got us from several thousand of the top 1,000 company CEOs all the way down to 200 that really passed this bar of excess returns in industry. They've been in role for 6 years. They passed a bunch of reputational screens. And then with that data in hand, we had the opportunity to sit down and interview one-on-one for several hours, 67 of those CEOs each at a time. And I think that's what's most exciting. We marry together the data with those stories. And so really going behind the curtain and understanding from Jamie Dimon and Mary Barra and Satya Nadella, all these incredible CEOs, what is the job really like? And what do you think can do differently that enables you to be so successful?
One of my thoughts about the book was, and I'd love you to speak on this. I mean, there's, I don't know, even in your own practice, decades of experience and studying CEOs, what works, from good to great, from best to better or whatever. Is there something that is happening now that makes the content of this book more unique? Is something changed? In other words, I guess, why did you think there was room on the bookshelf for another book? Maybe this is the first one, because I actually didn't find another one about CEOs. Talk about that for a bit.
Yeah, we did the same search that you did, right? And we found there's lots of books on leadership broadly, and there's lots of books on individual CEOs, right? Biographies or autobiographies. But we hadn't seen someone really take that systematic view across CEOs and say, what's the pattern recognition? And not just of CEOs in general, but those who've done it very well. What can we learn from that? And then you link that with what's happening in the world over the last few years and even the last few weeks. And I think we all realize that the world needs great CEOs right now, right? We need great leaders. And so all the more reason why we really wanted to understand, how do folks do this job well that's so incredibly complex? The scale is only growing. The scrutiny is only growing. What are those lessons learned? And it feels like there's lessons learned not just for CEOs, but frankly for all of us.
Set the frame for us and for the listeners about how and what you see the responsibilities of the CEO are at a strategic level. You talk about this in the book as a nice way to frame, okay, what does a CEO do for a living?
You're right. The kind of question number one was, what is the CEO role anyway, right? And we really spent time with each of these 67 and diving in on the research as well. And I will tell you, we tried to get it down to one or two simple things. The reality is you can't. Right? These jobs are complex, and the irreducible core of the role ends up being 6 different plates, if you will, that the CEOs are spinning at the same time. The first is they need to set the direction for the organization, right? Where are we going? They need to align and mobilize the organization, the culture and talent, so that they could get it done. They have to work with their leadership team and kind of set the tone from the top on how are we going to lead the place? What's that operating rhythm? They need to engage with their boards, again, something that's increasing in importance. They need to work with external stakeholders that are just multiplying, right? And then the 6th part is managing their own personal time and energy and effectiveness, right? How are they showing up as a leader? And as much as we tried to reduce it, we couldn't get shorter than that list of 6 things. And that's part of what makes the job so tough. It's a lot all at once. And you're trying to be the integrator across all of it.
And what strikes me is it's not 6 where you kind of have to divide more in the other. I mean, if you don't do all well equally, others quickly fall apart, right? Like, in other words, you can't focus on 5 and ignore the 6th. Is that been your experience as well?
Absolutely. I think you need to keep all 6 plates spinning, right? At the same time, depending on your context, you may shift your emphasis a little here or there, but the reality is all 6 need to be happening at once. And then you layer on top the fact that as the CEO, your job is not just to do each of those well. In fact, you don't have to be the best of the best at each of them. We liken it almost, if you take a sports analogy, right? You don't need to be the Serena Williams of tennis and, the Babe Ruth of baseball, but you do need to be the equivalent of the decathlete, right? The person who can do all of them at once. And at the same time, there's work that only you can do, which is the person finding the linkages across each of those 6, right? How are you balancing short-term versus long-term, internal versus external voices, stakeholders and shareholders, all of these sort of inbuilt tensions? It's your job to manage across those as well.
It's such a complex role and getting even more complex. Now, you put together, as is the title of the book, 6 mindsets, and it's a nice frame. So talk about these 6 mindsets. I mean, the one that jumped out at me that I hadn't thought as much about was how you now have a lot of bosses when you manage the board. I didn't put it in that same kind of context in my mind. You go from always reporting to one person or maybe 2, and now you could be reporting to 12 people, and it's just an interesting dynamic. But talk about these 6 mindsets that at a high level that you've discovered basically equal CEO excellence.
And this to us was a real insight, right? Rather than trying to memorize what each of the, what does Jamie Dimon do? What does, Kurt do? What do all these different folks do? If you can actually understand how they think, it gets you in the right mindset. And then all the behaviors flow from that. So we found a common mindset for each of the 6 responsibilities that really separated those who do it well. The first, for example, on setting direction, it's about truly being bold and having the courage not only to reframe what the company's trying to do and what the art of the possible is, but really swing resources behind the big bets that you're making, right? Not just letting the budget go from year to year with slight tweaks, right? Making some bold moves, taking a stand, and putting real money where your mouth is in terms of the boldness. If we take another one on the board, as you mentioned, right, the prevailing wisdom is sort of the board is something that you have to manage, right? At worst, it's something to be kept slightly at arm's length, let them do their job, but, minimize time spent. These excellent CEOs had a very different mindset. They said, how am I going to help the directors help me and help the business. I'm going to engage with the board in a way that I can think of these 10 or 12 people as an incredible resource to me. That means they have to have information, right? Hubert Joly talks about radical transparency, right? I have to actually share the good, the bad, and the ugly with my board so that they know enough that they have the right context. I have to make sure I have the right skills on the board. Marilyn Hewson at Lockheed Martin worked with her chair and then through to evolve the board itself to make sure she had the capabilities and skills on that board that were going to be most helpful to her. And then you have to engage with them and involve them in the decision making. All of that felt quite different in terms of saying, how do I help them help me, rather than something I need to manage just so that they can be backward looking.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've heard, what's the phrase I've heard, kind of arms out, ears in, or ears open kind of perspectives of the board. Just like, as a board member, don't get into the operational details, but how do you, I love that approach. How do you actually make them, I don't know, allies might not be the right word, but at least
helpful,
assets, maybe.
Right?
Yeah.
You think Jamie Dimon has this, he starts the board meeting. This doesn't mean giving them hundreds of pages of binders and saying, there, I'm being transparent. It's about the tone. So he pulls out a piece of paper, handwritten notes, and it says, here's the things that have happened since last we met, right? The good, the bad, and the ugly. Ivan at Diageo says, I have a 7x7, 7 things that I'm really proud of, I want you to know, and 7 things that are keeping me up at night. That's a level of transparency that many CEOs shy away from.
Interesting. All right. So you've touched on a couple of them. Keep going. Let's just surface all 6 of these, because and for the listeners, when they get the book, it's a really, it's a couple of hundred pages, but really it's 6 books in one, because it does break down each of these components. So that's why I wanted you to kind of double down on just outlining them.
Let's do it. On organization and culture, we talked about that a little bit in terms of the culture shifts happening, but these CEOs really treat the quote soft stuff as if it's the hard stuff, right? Whether it's culture, talent, org design, they apply real rigor to it, and they don't just leave it up to HR, right? Think about what Satya Nadella did at Microsoft. When he came in, he set a bold strategic vision around entering cloud and things like that, but an equally bold vision on culture, right? He talked about growth mindset. He popularized really that term. And he was very clear on what he expected of leaders and the kinds of behaviors that weren't tolerated anymore. They moved from a culture of the smartest person in the room to actually who's the most curious in the room, who wants to learn the most. And it went a long way to break down their silos and to break down some of their kind of very inward looking thinking. So taking the soft stuff and treating it hard, that applies to talent as well, which kind of bleeds into this idea of your top team. These excellent CEOs, I think we purposely put this kind of provocative phrase down, they don't put people first. Well, what does that mean? Of course they care about people, but what it meant was they started with the roles that mattered most. It turns out that in these big companies we were talking to, about 200 roles disproportionately contribute about 80% of the value, right? In a smaller company, maybe that's 50 roles. But beyond just the top team, even a few levels down in the organization, what are the roles that are most critical to deliver on your strategy, to deliver on your growth agenda or your turnaround? And do you as the CEO know which roles those are? And then those are the roles you pay attention to from a talent point of view. Now, hopefully you have your high potential list of talent, and those are the folks in those important roles. But you actually start with the roles first. If I'm doing a digital transformation, my head of digital, or if I'm growing in India, the country manager of India that might be 4 levels down is critical. Do I know who they are? Do I know if we have a good bench? Are we making sure we retain that person and reward them? So this notion of applying, value-driven thinking and analytics to the roles that matter and the talent I need is key. So that was another example. I'll hit off the last 2 real quick. Stakeholders, right? External stakeholders is one that I think every CEO, every leader is struggling with. And the expectations have gone through the roof in terms of the number of stakeholders who have an opinion on your business, an opinion on what you should be taking a stand on. And these excellent CEOs, rather than starting with who should I meet with and on what topics, they really ground themselves in the why. And they start with the why for them. Why does our company exist? What is our purpose? What is our set of values? What are we trying to do in the world? Why do we exist? And then as they think about their stakeholders, they ask, well, why is that stakeholder raising that point of view, right? Is it a community group? Is it someone driving an ESG agenda? Is it a customer or a regulator? What is it they're trying to solve for? And how do we find the common ground and the win-win? Right? I think about the CEO of Neste, who's kind of a Finnish oil company, and they were doing a lot of great things in ESG, they thought. Yet when the CEO drove to work in the morning, there were Greenpeace protesters outside the building. Now, he easily could have rebuffed it and said, look, we're doing great things. They just don't get it. He actually invited them into the building and ended up having a whole series of conversations with them about what Neste was trying to do and accomplish, what the Greenpeace folks were concerned about, and what's the shared agenda that they could pursue together, with them kind of coaching and counseling each other as they went over a number of months and years. It's a very, very different way to engage.
Yeah, no
and
kidding.
Then the last piece, and then I promise I'll stop, is really this personal effectiveness piece, right? Ultimately, there's only one human being in this role. And so what is it that the CEO can do to manage their time and energy and their own effectiveness? And the mindset there was, do only what you can do. Right? These CEOs were very, very focused, almost ruthless in saying, what is the work that only I can do as a CEO? Because if I don't do it, no one else can. And what's everything else that can be delegated? Right? And that applies to each of these areas, right? In strategy, what's the unique thing only I can do? I can give the permission to the organization to dream big, and I can make sure that our resources are allocated well, right? In organization, I can set the tone from the top of the culture and how we're going to work together, and what is the talent expectation of who we need to be. And they really focused on the unique role only they could play and made sure that their calendar and their time was allocated to those priorities. Because if you let it, 1,000 things will creep in. And, I think it was Ajay Banga at MasterCard, after a year in the role of really struggling with this, his team, his assistant and others said, look, if you can't decide what's important for your calendar, we can't do it for you. And it was a real wake-up call for him. And he ended up being much more disciplined in saying, this is what I need to be doing, and here's what everyone else can do. And it freed up that precious capacity that was only his.
I love that last part because, I've struggled with the same thing, the idea, I've called it role compression, right? If you wind up doing things you shouldn't be doing because they need to be done, the temptation to get things done. And I always reflect on, these CEOs, it's not like they've got 48 hours in a day, right? They still have the same constraint, they still have the same number of hours that I do, but they're running incredibly complex organizations. That's just such a great review. Now, for every one of those, there's exceptions to the rule: visionaries, mavericks, renegades. I mean, we have a CEO today, texting that he wants to take on Vladimir Putin for the Ukraine. I mean, it's just insanity. Are these exceptions that are edge cases? They fall outside the rule because some of these companies are pretty successful. How does that fit in your framework, and how do you think about it? Are they just such outliers that they're not useful to understand? Talk about that a bit.
Absolutely. I mean, in this set of CEOs we talked to, we purposely tried to get a range of across industries, across geography, across demographics, but also of ownership structures. So, some folks have said, hey, why are there not more founder-led CEOs in there? And we have a few. We have Reed Hastings at Netflix and a few others, but we purposely didn't stack the list with founder CEOs, right? Elon Musk isn't in there, for example, or Mark Zuckerberg. And part of it was they have degrees of freedom that, frankly, the rest of us don't have, right? They don't really report into a board. Many of them are majority shareholders. I mean, there's just things that they can do that are outside of the scrutiny that other CEOs realistically have to live under. And we were trying to create lessons learned that would apply to everyone. So we definitely didn't over-index on founders. But I think within that, and all the folks we did talk to, there was a really nice mix of, yes, some big famous names that you've heard of, but also a lot that you haven't, right? Doug Baker at Ecolab. We had, as I said, Maddie at Neste, Sandy Cutler at Eaton, because we found there's extraordinary CEOs everywhere. And these mindsets mindsets and practices, they embody those too. So it's not just about kind of the big maverick. It's about people day to day who are delivering extraordinary value for their shareholders, but also for their customers and their employees. And that's what we were excited about, the people who've delivered day in, day out, who keep the wheels turning.
Who should read the book? I mean, obviously, it's like a CEO handbook. You're a CEO, you're aspiring CEO, you're maybe going on to a board of directors, but do you conceive of this as lessons for everyone, or is this, it's a handbook for CEOs and that kind of group, and really they get the most out of it? When you were writing it, who were you imagining would be reading the book?
That's interesting. Because at first, you're right. We started off saying, how do we demystify the CEO role? And how do we share some of this wisdom? Because 50% of the CEOs we interviewed said the job was not what they expected and they wished they'd known more. But as it evolved, it became really clear that these lessons apply broadly, frankly, to all of us as leaders, wherever we are in the organization. If these guys can figure it out with the scale and complexity that they do, surely we can all do it too, right? We can think boldly. We can make sure we're very clear on how we want our teams to run. We can give them the permission and the courage to act in exciting ways, right? We can align our stakeholders, whoever those might be, and we can manage our own personal effectiveness. Those apply to everyone, whether it's public, private sector, not-for-profit, any level of the organization can take something away.
Last question for you, advice for the listeners. I mean, you've got such a depth of practice and expertise. You're talking to amazing people and you have amazing colleagues. Advice on how to deal and how to think about operating in such a turbulent world, getting more turbulenter every day, it would seem. Any last advice beyond what we can think about as a CEO, just from a leadership perspective?
Absolutely. And as you say, there's so much in the world at the moment. I think from these folks we talk to and from just broad recognition, the ones who navigate it well are the ones who are very centered and grounded, both in who are they as a leader, what matters to them, and how do they want to lead, right? Michael Fisher at Cincinnati Children's Hospital called it his to-be list is just as important as his to-do list. And I think especially in these times, leaders are being called upon, to be human and to bring humanity to their organizations and to be centered in, who are they as a leader and how do they bring confidence to all of their stakeholders. And then at the same time, they lead organizations that are very clear on their purpose and values as a company, right? And it's a time to really come back to who are we? What do we stand for? And that becomes a litmus test and a guide through all of these in-the-moment decisions that we're all having to make.
My guest is Carolyn Dewar. The book is CEO Excellence, available now on great places where you buy books. Carolyn, if folks want to just kind of keep in touch and follow you from an ongoing basis or learn more or even get in touch, how do they do that?
Absolutely. Would be happy to, whether it's on LinkedIn or via the McKinsey landing page. It's Carolyn Dewar, Dewar, just like the whiskey. And I'm at McKinsey. You can type that in and find me easily.
Well, Carolyn, thanks so much for joining me on The Voice of Retail. It's real treats. Great book. Anybody listening would benefit, whether you're a CEO or just want to understand leadership in a framework that puts a lot of complexity in a nice frame. So once again, congratulations on the book. I wish you continued success. And thanks again for joining me on The Voice of Retail.
Thank you so much. It's been super.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of The Voice of Retail. If you haven't already, be sure and follow on your favorite podcast platform so new episodes will land automatically each week. And be sure to check out my other retail industry media properties, Remarkable Retail Podcast with Steve Dennis and the Global E-Commerce Leaders Podcast. Last but not least, if you're into barbecue, check out my YouTube barbecue show, Last Request Barbecue, with new episodes each and every week. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc, consumer growth consultant, president of Emmy LeBlanc & Company, Inc., Maven Media, and keynote speaker. If you're looking for more content or want to chat, follow me on LinkedIn or visit my website at meleblanc.co. Safe travels, everyone.